I am excited. I don't even know how many times Mitch and I have literally said to each other, I'm so excited to have this conversation because we both are. I've had the honor of being friends with Mitch for several years now and seeing a lot of the really incredible food that he makes and a lot of the incredible bakes that he makes. And I don't know if we've ever actually had a conversation to just spend 1 hour dedicated to talking about food. And so I'm really excited to learn more about Mitch and what makes Mitch tick. And I'm going to do a little intro about myself. And then Mitch, I'd love if you could share some info about yourself as well. So my name's Tim Walsh. If you want to find more information about what I'm doing at any given time, you can find me on Instagram at Classic Tim Makes. That's where I'm most active. I've been in the kitchen and cooking since I was 4 years old. My mom got tired of making me French toast every Saturday morning so that I had it in time for cartoons. And she just said, look, this is how you do it. It's up to you now. And since then, I've been cooking and I've loved cooking ever since. And my purpose of these events is I want to demystify the kitchen. I want to get people into the kitchen and cooking and using the tools that they've got and really enjoying the creativity that's inside of them. And so that's what's really driving me here. I want to help empower you to do really cool things in your life, specifically in the kitchen. And I'll do my best as an intro for Mitch. And then, Mitch, I'd love to get your take. Mitch, as I already said, is really, really talented, probably one of the nicest human beings I've ever met. He's classy to a T, and his bakes, the best way I could come up with to describe his bakes are from babkas to scones, bagels to cinnamon rolls, and croissants to country loaves. Mitch has an impressive array of not just baked goods, but sourdough baked goods, because he doesn't just let things stand at their regular level of difficulty. He often takes it to that next level and asks himself, how can I make this a sourdough?
Wow. Well, that was a very flattering intro. And thank you, Tim, for having me and for the background. Tim gives me a lot of credit. I'm just like a very amateur baker. I'll definitely give some background on myself. So, like Tim, I grew up with a mom who was like, "Hey, you should just start cooking." And I started cooking from a young age, and like started just always looking and seeing what she was doing. And I was probably one of the few kids in my friend group in college who actually knew how to cook. So that was always a fun thing. And since then, I've always like, I just love understanding food at a deeper level and trying new things. Like, I think one of the things at my core is when I see something like in the real world, like I'm at a store or at a cafe or something, I'm like, oh, that looks good. I want to go to try to make that. It's just something, I take upon myself. So I have taken a stab at all those things that Tim mentioned. Can't say I did them all successfully, but hey, that's part of being a baker. And it's part of I think my favorite part is just the process. I'm also a San Francisco native or Bay Area native, live in San Francisco now. So they say SF has some of the best sourdough out there. So it's like, all right, let's put a good word to that.
Nice. Okay, so you got started in the kitchen because your mom asked you to, or she just kind of pushed you in a good direction. Hey, maybe you should start cooking. What was the first thing you ever baked? And what was the story behind it?
The first thing I ever baked was, oh man. The first thing I have recollection of baking, I should say, was a loaf of sourdough bread. Like I'm sure I baked some things in the past. Like I'm Jewish, and we made matzah growing up every now and again, and like that was kind of fun. But like in my recent memory, it was a loaf of sourdough. I think you actually gave me the starter for it from Josie Baker's The Mill, which if you don't know, it's a bakery in San Francisco. It's a really good bakery. Actually, I have to just show that my very first bread, which was a total flop. Oh no, I can't share my screen. Are you able to?
Let me see if I can give you that.
If not, it's not a big deal, but I always like to show like how terrible my original bread was.
keep talking, and I'm gonna see if I can
Anyway.
change that setting.
Yeah, no worries. So yeah, I mean, it was a loaf of sourdough bread. It actually tasted not bad. I remember even bringing it into my work office, which I was a little embarrassed to do. I'm like, do I really want to bring this in? I'm like, what else am I gonna do with it? And people were like, yeah, that's kind of bread. So people were nice enough about that. But since then I've always tried tinkering with a little bit more, getting a little bit better over time. That's okay if you
Okay.
can't figure it out,
See if
Tim.
you
No
can
worries.
share the screen now. Someone was pinging me
Okay,
in directions.
let's see. There we go.
Yeah.
The very first loaf. It's floppy and dense, and it was average at best. No, it wasn't even average. But so yeah, that's where we started.
So for comparison, do you have a loaf you could show us that's one of your more recent loaves?
Let's see.
So I know I've seen some of your more recent loaves. So it's nice. It's a nice A/B test or way to show folks like how quickly you could ramp up on sourdoughs.
Totally. Oops. Let's see. I think I got one here. This is a more artsy photo one. You get to see the ear of the bread,
Oh, nice.
which is, you know,
There's even
my
a little
favorite part.
blistering going on there.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think this was
huge
like
difference.
some sort of a seedy sourdough or something. You can see some poppy seeds in there, which if you haven't tried that, adding seeds into bread is like probably the best thing ever because I love texture when I'm eating. So having that little crunch of something is like so nice. And then especially if you toast the bread, it gets all like toasty and crispy. It's winner.
Nice. All right. So wait. So the first thing you've ever baked was actually the sourdough bread,
Yeah,
like a
I
couple
don't.
years ago.
Yeah, I was not really a baker growing up. I always liked cooking. I was actually intimidated by baking because um, so I'm a science major and I found it very easy to like follow recipes for some reason. But baking, I was just like thrown off by like, okay, it's very exact. You have to like get the measurements right and you have to get a scale. Like who wants to get a scale to cook something that's like that to me was such a big turnoff from baking initially. So yeah, I really didn't bake much growing up.
Okay. I had no idea. I
Yeah.
thought you've been baking this whole time and you're just like, oh, let's add sourdough to the repertoire.
No, I just love sourdough and I was like, I'm paying a lot of money for it every time I go to the cafe or bakery. I should just figure out how to do this myself.
Well, that's even, to my mind, that makes it even more impressive at how quickly you've taken off with your sourdough baking.
I mean, I think I see it kind of as there's a very quick like increase to like getting better at baking, and then it kind of plateau a little bit. I think that's the same with anything. You're like any new skill you're trying to learn, where it's like, all right, you pick it up pretty quickly from like, and you get average, and then you try to like become a master on something. I'm not even close to that, but like there's always that slower level toward the end of actually becoming really, really good at something.
Yeah, there's kind of those moments of rapid growth and then what feels like not much growth for a period of time, but that almost always precedes another moment of rapid growth. It's that
Exactly.
strange, you like hit a flat spot so that you can gain the momentum to go up again.
I feel like
Yeah,
there's like some sort of technical term for that
probably.
learning
It's probably
curve,
like
but
some dude named it after himself. And
yeah,
yeah.
exactly.
All right. So
I'm just gonna hit the light really quick.
yeah.
Start over here.
So when it comes to your baking now, what is it that you're currently focusing on or practicing or trying to get better at?
Um, I'd say what I'm like consistency. I think that's the biggest thing because I find, what I've learned with sourdough is it's when you're working with wild yeast, you're so dependent on the external variables around you, whether it's the temperature, the humidity, or the whatever like natural yeast is in the air at that point in time, or like the water temperature, the flour temperature. There's just like so many variables. So like I've been able to get good-ish bread for the last few months, I'd say, but I can't go and like be like, okay, I'm gonna make this exact loaf and I'm gonna have it scored this perfect way and it's gonna look like this. Like I follow some bakers on Instagram and I'm like, how do you just get so consistent? Or you go to a bakery and it's like every single loaf looks the exact same. Not there yet. So I think consistency is one of the big things I'm trying to get better at. And then also just like experimenting with different flavors, I guess. I've ordered like this 25-pound bag of wheat berries a while ago and got my own mill, which is exciting. It's just like a attachment for a mixer, but it's pretty handy. You get like fresh milled flour. But now I'm like, okay, let's get some other types of wheat to work with. So I think I just got some spelt and some einkorn. I'm probably butchering the pronunciation of that.
I think that's right. Einkorn.
Okay. So yeah, I'm gonna experiment with that. I made a chocolate sourdough recently, which was really delicious. It was like a dessert, but
Like a chocolate sourdough loaf?
yeah. Here, I have a photo of that one pulled up.
Did you end up mixing any sugar into it while you're preparing it, or was it really just kind of a loaf mixed with either cocoa powder or, wow, that looks phenomenal?
I did add sugar to it because I was like, I saw some recipes that didn't call for sugar, but I was like really going for, I wanted like a sweeter loaf, which I'd never done before, and I guess loaf of sourdough. But I decided to give it a shot, and it turned out awesome. But then because I used dark chocolate for both the cocoa powder as well as the chocolate chips, so it was really dark, but then the sugar definitely helped balance it out.
Okay. And so I was thinking along really similar lines recently. I was like, what if I made a sourdough loaf with like chunks of chocolate in it spread throughout? So it's almost like a chocolate chip sourdough. But I was wondering about whether or not I should add sugar and how much, and then more importantly, how that might affect the fermentation. I would imagine the yeast or the bacteria becomes a bit more active because of the added sugar, yeah?
I'm trying to remember if I noticed it went faster. To be honest, I don't remember, but it definitely it fermented pretty well. The one thing I wish I had done differently is I mixed the flour and water and let it sit the autolyse for like an hour or two, and then I added the cocoa powder after. But at that point, it had already kind of binded, so the cocoa powder was so hard to mix in. I had to spend a good 15 minutes trying to just mix it by hand to get it all evenly distributed. So I probably would have put that in at the very beginning. But other than that, I didn't notice anything too drastically different actually in the fermentation, which was good.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah,
Good to know.
and I actually just got this new cookbook called New World Sourdough.
Yep. I just saw that for the first time today, and it's on my wish list on Amazon right now. And I almost ordered it 5 minutes before this call, but I figured prepping for the call was more important.
It's a cool cookbook because he works with a lot of enriched doughs where he's adding like sugar and some sort of fat, whether it's like butter or milk to it, which gives it a totally different consistency at times.
Yeah, he's got some brioches in there. He's got some more kind of dessert things, some conchas. Am I saying that right?
I don't remember that one.
I think that's it's sort of like a medium or larger roll that's got a crackle top to it. I think it's a little on the sweeter side.
Yes.
Usually attributed to Mexican culture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he does have that one in there. He also had I think it was called a coco de pan or something. If I remember correctly, he has some sort of Honduran roots, I want to say. And so a lot of it is trying to blend these flavors. So he has all sorts of sweet breads and stuff. It's really interesting, yeah.
So I guess that leads me to another line of questioning that I was interested in getting into and chatting with you about, and that's favorite cookbooks.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have an all-time favorite? What are you geeking out on right now, if it's anything other than the New World sourdough? And a runner-up question of those is, for anyone who wanted to get started in sourdough baking, where would you point them first?
For that, I'll start with that one first. I think Josie Baker's cookbook, which I think you are currently doing a giveaway on your Instagram for that right now.
Yeah, true. Yeah, if you go to @ClassicTimMakes on Instagram, I'm doing a cookbook giveaway a week, and this week is actually Josie Baker's Josie Baker bread. And I agree with Mitch. Perfect. Yeah, not sponsored, but he did comment on the post, so that was cool.
Oh,
and giving away that cookbook. go in, like the post, leave a comment, and you are in the running to win it. But yeah, I completely agree. He did a really great job in that book of making sourdoughs very approachable.
Yeah, that. He starts at a very like basic level of let's make a like not even, I don't think it was a sourdough. It's like using active dry yeast and make a loaf in a pan. So it's like it's almost mindless. You just mix all the stuff, throw in a pan, and let it go. But then you're built. Each recipe builds on the last recipe. So I like that. And admittedly, I kind of skipped ahead a little bit because if you do every single recipe, you're making a good like 20 loaves, which is not like a ton, but I like the progression of it. And he talks a lot about like the technique of how you want to do the stretch and folds, how you want to like fold the dough and prepare it. So yeah, I thought it's a great cookbook. I have been using the Tartine cookbook, which from a technical perspective, it's like so awesome. It has so much detail about like how you should be, preparing your bread. You and I have spoken about this, like the formatting of it is a little overwhelming. It's a lot of like big blocks of text, but the content is really good.
Yeah, it's like getting started. The Josie Baker bread book is phenomenal. But when you're ready to then graduate or go a little bit deeper or really understand how temperature and time affects your sourdough loaf in particular, the Tartine bread book is really great. But then totally agree, there's huge pages of really dense text that aren't there in the middle of a recipe. So there might be a recipe on one page, you flip a couple pages, you're still in that recipe, but there's a huge page of dense text talking about what you need to do next. And then the next 2 pages are beautiful photos. And then the page after that is the next step you have to do in the recipe. So you kind of need to read through it a few times beforehand to know your steps, or just be willing to have very doughy fingers, flipping all the pages in your cookbook, or have a girlfriend who you can just say, hey, can you flip that back? Okay, flip it forward again. Okay, back. Okay, okay, I think I got it. 5 minutes later, you do the same thing.
The photos in the Tartine book are awesome though. And I think that is one advantage it has over Josie's and other cookbooks I've used, is that it's step by step and it's like really detailed, like, oh, this is what this photo is for. So I like that one. And then one other, I have not used this one personally. It's called Bread Baking for Beginners. I've heard about this one a lot. Mostly I follow Jenna Fisher on Instagram, and she speaks very highly of this one, and I've read about it, and it's seems like a good cookbook.
All right. I don't think I've ever heard of this one.
Yeah.
I recently picked up, I have not yet cracked it open, but on recommendation of my old pottery instructor, who was a classically trained chef and pastry chef from the Culinary Institute of America. It's like every other time I post something on Instagram and my bake doesn't have enough color, I get a message from her directly being like, stop doing that. You need to bake it longer. It needs more color. And so finally she just started sending me the link to the course book, which is, I mean, it's a textbook about baking. And I'm excited to dive into that, but it's a little daunting because of how big it is.
Yeah. Sounds really cool though. I'd be curious to see what's in
Yeah.
there. But yeah, like outside of baking, I think you and I have spoken about this one as well, the Food Lab, Kenji Lopez, who's also a Bay Area native or local, I guess. That one's awesome because it's like, again, I mentioned that before, I was like a science major, and for me, it's like so scientific in how he goes about like, here's how to make the perfect hard-boiled egg, and he has like, I don't know, like 20 different variants and all these different variables, and it's like it's kind of overwhelming, but essentially is like, this is how you should do it. Here's how I figured that out.
Yeah, it's this. He's nailed this really strange combination of reference guide and readable resource. Like you can read through the book. It's big. Again, it's 800 plus pages of large format, lots of text, but it's fascinating. Like if you love cooking, you're going to be voraciously reading through the whole thing. And I'm probably 2/3 of the way through. Every couple months I pick it up, and I like every page. Every couple months I pick it up and I read further. I take tons of notes, and then you can ask my girlfriend Cal. Actually, my copy's up on the shelf here. I pull that thing down all the time because there's nuances that it shares with you about cooking that you don't really find other places, and it does a really good job of explaining it, about why you might want to do it, or how you can test whether or not you've rested meat long enough, which no one ever talks about. They just say rest the meat. All right, well, how long do I rest a turkey versus a steak? And there's actually ways to figure that out,
Yeah.
which is pretty cool.
Tim, I get the sense that if you and I went to college together, you'd be the very studious one who would like had perfect notes, and I'd be the one who was like cramming before like a final the day before, and like this is the exact page I need to read and just skip ahead.
No, in college, my trick was to just show up for class, and
Okay.
then the night before a test, get a good night's sleep. I refused to. Mark is on the call right now. He could corroborate because we had a lot of classes together, and there were nights where I think Mark was cramming, and I was like, yeah, I think sleep's more important tonight, so I'm just gonna sleep, and I think if I'm feeling good tomorrow, I'm gonna do better on the test. It doesn't always work with computer science. So I studied computer science in college, and we had fewer tests, but more programs we had to deliver. And there were times where like you just had to get the work done. And I don't know if the professors did this on purpose. I think a couple of them did, but they would assign projects that took longer than the period of time they gave you if you slept. And so there was one project in particular where, and I'm bringing this up because Mark's here because I know he's going to appreciate it. There's one project in particular, they assigned it on Monday. It was due on a Friday. And after we had looked at the project, we realized there's no way you can get this done and still attend other classes. And so I woke up on Monday. We started working on the project. I didn't go to sleep until I want to say 4 a.m. on Friday, because we just kept working through. I don't think that was a great idea because I was hallucinating after 2 or 3 days of no sleep. And like I probably wrote some really terrible code, but we got it submitted, and I think we got a decent grade.
Yeah, not too shabby. Did you guys cook in college?
I mean, as much as we could afford to.
Yeah, of course.
But like college was a great time to introduce other people to things like beer bread,
Mm.
because it's really easy. It's super easy. And it's for anyone interested, beer bread is typically a mixture of about 3.5 cups of flour, 1 bottle of your favorite beer. I like to use Blue Moon because there's a nice little zestiness to it. And then it's probably like, I want to say half a tablespoon of baking powder and a pinch of salt. And if you want to jazz it up a bit, you could put half a cup of sugar in there, and a little bit of honey even would be nice. If you don't want it to be on the sweeter side, you could add things like rosemary and grated cheddar. And it's super easy. And if you want to make it even easier, you could buy self-rising flour, and you don't have to add the salt or the baking powder. And it's 3.5 cups self-rising flour, 1 bottle of beer. And when you're in college and you're trying to impress people when you go to parties, that's the best recipe, because start to finish, the whole thing's ready for you to bring with you in less than an hour. Plus, it's
Good
got
bang for
beer
your
in the
buck
name.
too.
What's that?
Yeah, it's good bang for your buck.
Yeah. It's like, you can afford it in college, and it impresses other people because you showed up with food and it actually tastes good.
There you go. I've actually not tried that before, but I've heard good things, so maybe that's on my list.
Every once in a while, when I need a really fast bread for something, I'll still go back to beer bread. I tend to use standard flour and then add the baking powder and the salt now, but yeah.
It's pretty like a dense bread, right?
It can be. I've been playing around more with the flour that I use in it, as well as the mixing involved. Because the first recipe I found when I was in college was basically like, just mix until everything's wet and you're done. And that can actually make a fairly fairly light, craggly bread.
Right.
And a few weeks ago, I was like, I haven't made this in a while, and I want to play around with this. And I just mixed the hell out of it. Just really tried to form as much gluten as I could. And I used a bread flour so that I'd get more protein content to it. And it was this crazy dense, smooth top bread. I wasn't expecting at all. I'd never seen that out of the beer breads before. Still tasted great, but it's crazy how much either working your dough or using a different flour can totally change the whole process sometimes. Same exact ingredients sometimes, like even if I didn't change the flour to be bread flour. working it that much more than I typically did is going to give me a totally different result. With the more gluten, you're going to be able to hold on to things a little bit more. It's going to be I don't want to say tougher, but it's going to be a bread that has less crumb to it and has more
Hmm.
structure to it.
Hmm. I've always wanted to try, like we talk a lot about bread with high protein content, but I've always wanted to try like the total opposite end of that. Make a sourdough with like either, I mean, all-purpose flour is not like totally void of protein, um, but like see what happens. And because I've seen some photos online of people trying all-purpose flour like sourdough loaves, and it looks actually fine, like totally fine. So I guess if you were in a pinch, you could probably just do that. I haven't tried it though.
I think so. I was trying that recently with the tartine method, and I think it makes it a lot more difficult to shape the loaf because
Hmm.
I think it creates much less structure, and so you
I can
get
see
this
that.
much flatter, denser loaf. Um, but you can also play around with your ratios. Yeah, I used almost 90%
Okay.
all-purpose flour, so I was really going for it.
I've used some of it in like loaves I'm trying to make that are like fluffier. So I've done some, I was mentioning before, like I have this like fascination with like, okay, here's something I can buy in a store or I can just go make it at home. So like a loaf of sandwich bread, for example, like the stuff you have growing up as a kid. Um, in making homemade sandwich bread, it's like so much better than what you buy in a store. But I use like all purpose for that to like get it to be a little fluffier than like the bread flour, which I feel like makes it kind of like you get that. It's a good texture when you get the nice big loaf, but for a slice, I feel like you want something a little bit lighter.
Yeah, you want it light, but you want the structure on the inside to be tight enough that
Hmm.
you don't necessarily have giant holes in it and like everything
Exactly.
falling through. Even though that looks beautiful with the sourdough, it's not necessarily effective sometimes.
I've never understood that. Some people post photos on online of like, here's this loaf of sourdough I made. Look at these giant like air holes in there. I'm like, I don't want that in my slice of bread.
Right? It probably tastes amazing.
Yes.
And maybe they're using like the world's densest peanut butter and spreading it in there and filling all the gaps. It's like a bread waffle. But
Sounds
I,
delicious.
I see Mark nodding his head like, well, it doesn't sound like a bad idea. But but yeah, I agree. Like there's kind of there's a balancing point. But as you were saying, because you're making the bread at home, you get to make that decision, which is kind of one of the really cool parts. Like
Yeah.
you can decide, yeah, that's how the store would make it, but I actually want it this way. And after a little while, you kind of learn those variables that allow you to do it. You know how to change moisture content, or you know how to change your fermentation time if you want something to taste more or less sour.
Right. Um, and actually one of the, so we were talking about like bread books that we like. I found a website that I came across called The Perfect Loaf, which is, I think he was like some former engineer who became like a home baker and now he's like this big online presence. And he had this recipe recently that really caught my eye. That was a loaf of sandwich bread, but you actually pre-cook the flour. So you literally mix the flour with water and you just cook that alone in a pan on really low heat until it kind of like thickens up into a paste. And then you let that cool and then you mix that in with your bread. And I guess the idea is that's supposed to help. It creates some of the same elements of like of creamy textures or like fluffy textures you might get if you add extra fat like milk or butter, but you do it without that. So it's just like it's a really cool way to make it like light and fluffy. I never heard of it before, so it's pretty cool.
Weird. That I mean, that reminds me a lot of some very traditional French sauces. They often start with a base of flour and water that you
Hmm.
cook in a pan at a lower temperature. You try to stir it up, and then you start adding more flavors. You do often add something like cream to it, but that can be often a base because you need some sort of thickener in a lot of those sauces.
Yeah,
But I've
I can
never
see
heard
that.
that done for baking bread before.
Yeah, it was pretty unique, but you know what? Like I made it once and I was like, holy smokes, this is really good. And I am now going to only do that when I'm making this loaf of bread.
Well, now my mind is racing about all the things you could do in that step to make it more interesting. Like, could you infuse certain flavors into the flour when you're
Totally.
doing it? Like,
Yeah.
could you add cocoa at that point? Could you make like a lemon loaf? So you've got like some lemon zest that you throw in there, or that you somehow steep in it for a little while, or if you had
Hmm.
water that you steeped in something and then use that water for cooking with the flour to then flavor
Yeah,
your final loaf?
that'd be interesting. We'll have to experiment with that a little bit.
Yeah.
But yeah, the technique was, and it's obviously very easy, but I like the outcome of it.
Okay. And what was the name of the website again?
The Perfect Loaf, or
Perfect Loaf. Okay.
The Perfect Loaf, or just perfectloaf.com. Yeah, just perfectloaf.com.
Okay. Cool.
That he takes a very similar, like what we were talking about Kenji Lopez's in the Food Lab book. He takes a very similar, like, scientific analytical approach to baking. And these are the types of things that, like, early on would have intimidated me, because he's like talking about, he has, in every recipe he talks about the temperature of the flour, and he talks about like the ambient temperature, and I'm like, oh my gosh. But when you look at it, it starts to kind of make sense. I sometimes gloss over some of the details of like temperature, and just like follow the process of the ingredients. But and then like when he's talking about like the weights, he has it down to like, maybe not to the decimal, but it's very precise. But it's a good website, and he has like a variety of recipes on there. So I like that one.
Nice. Yeah. For flour temp, I've seen that mentioned in a few places, and my way around that is, in order to get it consistent, I often, and I got this partially because of you, because you gave me a warning. I often refrigerate my flour beforehand. So then my flour is always the same temperature. So I can adjust my process from the ambient room temperature, but it's one fewer variable to worry about.
Smart, yeah.
And the reason I started doing that is because at the beginning of COVID, when it was really hard to find flour, Mitch was one of the only people I knew who had access to flour because he had that flour mill he mentioned earlier and a bunch of wheat berries. So I had to text him and be like, hey, any chance you could grind me up a few pounds of wheat berries so I can have some flour? And he was super generous. He wouldn't even accept my money for it. And he said, just one warning, if you're not going to use this within the next 2 weeks, you should refrigerate it, because it can kind of start to go bad. The stuff you get in the store has some extra stuff added into it, so it lasts a little longer. And that's when I started thinking, well, what if I kind of do that all the time in a way that benefits my process?
Yeah, but see, then what I realized is one of the big, like, points of like the value proposition of getting a flour mill is like you want that freshly milled. So what I do now is I keep a small like portion of it in my fridge that I'll use for like feeding my starter every day. But then when I'm gonna like bake a loaf, then I'll weigh out my wheat berries and then grind it fresh and just mix it right away. So it's like you're getting that really fresh flour. But um, yeah, I don't know if it's actually true that it can go bad sitting out. You made me second guess it, but I read it somewhere online, so I was like, I just gotta tell him, and I don't want him to get like sick because of me.
Well, I mean, I don't think it hurts anything. I've heard of people
Sure.
refrigerating their flour before anyway. So, I mean,
Yeah.
it gave me a new idea about how to make my bakes consistent. So I'm not going to
Sure.
complain about that.
And now you got your own flour mill, which is like
I do.
massive. It's like
It
an
is.
oil rig or something.
I think it was originally designed to be like a feed mill on a farm, but you can adjust it, or at least I was able to adjust it to be fine enough that you can mill flour with it. Now it's loud. It's crazy loud. I wear hearing protection when I run it in my kitchen because it's so loud, but it's really effective. I can grind, I want to say something like 5 pounds of wheat or wheat berries in, if I'm moving quick, 3 to 5 minutes.
Dang.
Because the slowest part is actually that I grind the wheat berries at least twice. So I run it through the mill once, and I get a pretty good grind. And then I take those and I run it through again, and it's really messy once it's done that first time. And there's a bunch of flour flying up into the air, and I use a bag to try to like pour it back into the funnel. And if I moved quicker, I'd make more mess, but I could get it done faster. But it's just a giant motor with two grinding plates. And so it moves pretty quick. But after that second grind, I have a pretty fine flour.
That's impressive.
I actually have to use
Yeah.
that after this call because I don't know if you can see the container at the end here is my whole wheat flour, and it's all out. I don't even have enough flour to feed my starter tomorrow morning. So I gotta I gotta grind some.
Gotta keep that sucker fed.
Yep.
What do you
Yeah.
do with your excess when you're feeding your starter? What do you do with your leftovers?
So I've got this great system. I recently bought a ton of these little deli containers, just reusable, dishwasher safe, everything. Super cheap. It was a pack of 50 for probably like $12. And they're all the same size, so all the lids fit, every single one of them. And what I do is I feed my starter, I take the excess, I pour it into a deli container, and the best part of the whole process is that I let my girlfriend Kala then cook it up later in the day, and she eats it as a sourdough pancake.
Mm,
So it's
I've
very
done that.
important that you have someone else who wants to eat it, but it's a great system if you've got that set up.
The sourdough pancake is so good. Like literally, you just take the starter and just pour it in a pan with some oil, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And you can mix up with like seeds or spices or anything.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. It's like if you like the sour flavor, it really comes through when you're having
Oh,
just like
yes.
100% sourdough starter.
Yes. It is very apparent, very clear what you're eating. But I have found the trickiest part of cooking it is finding the right heat, because you can definitely cook the outside too quick and the inside's way
Yep.
too gummy. But then you can cook the outside far too slow, and then you basically get a big cracker.
Hmm.
So it's not too crazy. Just probably the first time you make it, don't expect it to be perfect. But because you're feeding your starter every single day, you get another chance tomorrow.
How much do you feed your starter? Because I remember when I was first getting into it, like it was saying, oh, you want to do like 100 grams of flour or something. And then over time, I've slowly like dialed that back less and less. I think now I'll do somewhere between like 30 to 50 grams, depending on what mood I'm in. But like, and also I know during COVID when there was such a flour shortage, uh, Josie Baker on Instagram, he was like, you don't have to worry about like putting in tons of flour. All you really need to do is like, you could even do it with as little as like 5 grams of flour. Like all you're just trying to do is replenish the nutrients in there. But I'm curious what you do.
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought this up, because I wanted to dive into this deeper with you too, because I have a feeling we probably have different schedules and mindsets, and so I wanted to learn where your head's at. So I feed, let's see, I discard all but 10 grams of my starter every morning, and then I put in 80 grams of flour and 80 grams of cool water. I used to measure the temp of the water, and the first directions I got is like, I want to say 75 degrees for feeding the
Yeah.
starter, and 85 when you're making your leaven for making your bread. And I did that for a few weeks when I was really paranoid and didn't know any better. And then eventually, I think one day I didn't have time, and then nothing went wrong.
Not worth
So
the effort.
yeah, so I use the cooler water because it slows the fermentation down a little bit, so
Yeah.
that if I need the bread to be, or the starter to be more active, I can switch it up. But it makes the feeding cycle just about 24 hours for me, so I can do it every morning.
Hmm.
And then when I know there's extended periods of time where I'm not going to be making sourdough, I'll feed it, wait about an hour, and then I'll throw it in the fridge. And it lasts for weeks. I think
Hmm.
I've accidentally left my starter in the fridge for months without feeding,
Oh yeah.
and it came out not looking great. But I grabbed 10 grams of starter, and I started a new batch. And within a couple days, like the first day, you could see there's activity. Within a couple days, it was back to normal.
Yeah, it's surprisingly resilient, like, and it will come back really quickly. But yeah, so like I guess I have a similar schedule. I'll do make it in the morning. I already have my scale out for my coffee, so then I'll just move the coffee out of the way and put the starter on there. And I think I'm usually doing like I said, like 30 to 50 grams of flour. And I'm the same way with the water. Like I just pour in some cool water and then call it a day. And I don't know, I'm a bad starter daddy, because there's times when I'll not feed it for a few days and I'm like, oh, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry. And then I feed it and it comes right back and it's totally fine. But
It's very
even like,
forgiving.
I don't know, actually, but maybe it was a couple weeks ago when it was so hot here in San Francisco, it was like it had hit 100 degrees or something. I noticed my starter started doing some real funky things. Like I think it even got a little bit of mold in there. And I was reading about it online, and it did say that because of all the humidity, like in the starter and the heat, it just like is like a mold loves it, and it will start growing if it's like over 90 degrees. So if there ever is another like heat wave, I'll definitely put it in the fridge just to let it sit there.
Yeah, I was noticing some funky stuff on mine too, where I didn't get any mold, but I could definitely tell it was way more active. Like the
Hmm.
smell the next morning, way more pungent, way more acid to it. I think it's, the tartine bread goes into really good detail. Tartine bread book goes into really good detail about acetic acid versus oleic acid or olenic acid or something like that, and which one brings out which scents and flavors. And I can't remember which one's which right now, but the one that's really, really acidic was definitely strong.
Yeah. Yeah, that's why the temperature is like so tricky to deal with sometimes. And then on the flip side, sometimes if I'm in a time crunch or if it's just like too cool in the room, a trick I've done, which is I'll actually put it in the oven with just the oven light on, and it actually surprisingly gets pretty warm in there. With just the oven light, it'll help it, pick up the fermentation process, which is awesome.
Yeah, so my oven has this really crazy feature where it burns out light bulbs within 2 weeks. So
Hmm.
I can't. We've bought new light bulbs a couple times, and they seem to burn out within 2 weeks every time for some reason. So instead, what I'll do sometimes I'll preheat the oven at the lowest temp it can get, but I'll only let it preheat for 10 minutes. Then I turn it
Yeah,
off, and then I'll throw it in there. Um, or sometimes the opposite is if I need to slow down fermentation, but not slow it down so much that you get in the fridge, I'll take like a cold pack from the freezer and I'll put a couple of them near the bowl. So I'm sort of
hmm,
dropping the ambient temperature of the sourdough. So when I was having to go into the office every day back in the day, if people can remember that, when we had to
what's an
travel to
office?
an office, yeah, right, that place where they're supposed to have snacks or something. Um, there were days where I would prep the bread in the morning, but the next step was supposed to happen an hour and a half later, and I'd be gone for 8 hours. So what I
Hmm.
would do is I'd take I guess at that point well, I guess this the starting point of my bread with everything mixed together, and I'd throw it in a cupboard wrapped in some kitchen towels, and then right next to it I'd have a couple cold packs, so that the cupboard kind of became like an ice box or a little bit of a cooler, and it slowed things down enough that when I got home it was about the right
Hmm.
time to do those next steps.
That's smart. That's a good way to do it. But you hit on an interesting point. Like back when we were going into the office, my baking was concentrated around the weekends. And now working from home, it's so much easier to be able to manage a baker's schedule like during the week, which is awesome. So you can get freshly baked bread every day.
Yeah, or like you can kind of prep bulk amounts of certain kinds of dough, like brioche is good for this,
Yep,
and then take little bits as you need them and just bake it off in the morning or something.
that's true. I haven't done that one yet. But then if you have the bulk, like what, you have it sitting in the fridge or something?
So brioche in particular actually freezes really well,
Huh.
and you can do a sourdough brioche and that also will freeze well. And so you can kind of portion it out into the amounts you expect to use in the future and have a bunch of pre-made dough that you put all the work in one day, and later you get to reap the rewards.
That's interesting. I'll have to give that a shot.
Yeah, I think if you have frozen brioche and you want it ready the next day, just take it out of the freezer and put it in the fridge the night before so that it
Okay.
slowly thaws.
Yeah, so Tartine also has a recipe for sourdough croissants, which I've taken a stab at a couple times to varying degrees of success. And
I
it's
mean,
kind of similar. It's like,
you say that with hesitation, but I want everyone else on the call to understand that, like, Mitch is really talented, but he's also probably going to be the first
mm,
person to criticize his bakes. I highly recommend you check out his Instagram and see some of the stuff he's baked because it's gorgeous.
well,
And
I appreciate that compliment. I will admit, I've done a batch of good sourdough croissants, but I did one last weekend and it totally was not good at all. It was like just very dense. It was almost like you don't want a croissant to be dense. You want it to be like light and flaky and airy. This one was like biting into a loaf of bread, kind of. So it wasn't great. And I don't know. I've had a lot of trouble with that one with the lamination process, and then like when I baked it, all the butter kind of seeped out. After reading a little more, I think might have had to do. I didn't let it proof long enough once they were actually all rolled up. But point being, the base for that sourdough croissant is actually brioche. So, and one of the things they do is you can actually make the croissants, roll them up, and put those in the freezer and leave them there for months. And then you want a fresh croissant, pull it out, and you have to let it proof for a couple hours out of the freezer. But once you do, you just throw it in the oven. So, brioche, I guess, is pretty flexible, I guess.
Nice. Yeah, I know a good number of bakers who their go-to dough is brioche because it's so flexible. Like you can use
Mm-hmm.
brioche in a savory bake. You can use it in a sweet bake. You can braid it. You can turn it into buns. You can apparently turn it into croissants. Like it's a very flexible dough in terms of execution.
I think it was also a brioche base that I tried making recently. Was I have a guilty pleasure for King Arthur's Hawaiian sweet rolls, whatever that brand is, the orange
Oh yeah.
bag. Those things, those are so good, especially if you have like some pulled pork or whatever it might be. So I wanted to make some, and I tried making it at home, and it actually turned out really good. And the secret to that is actually a little bit of called for pineapple juice. I didn't have any. I used orange juice, but it gives it like a little tartness and sweetness. So it was
Okay.
good.
Is it the acidity in that juice that probably does it?
I think so. 'Cause you don't put a ton of it in, just like a splash, maybe like 1 to 2 tablespoons, and then you also add some additional sugar in there as well to give it the sweetness.
That makes sense. Sugar
Yeah,
tends to work well for sweetness.
that it does.
Nice. Um, so what are I just came up with some different ways of how I do this, but I also want to get your thoughts on this. What are some of the ways you get your water to the right temperature when you're making sourdoughs? Because I found for the longest time that getting the volume of water I need at the right temperature was just strangely difficult. Like I'd use the microwave and I'd overshoot it and then have to wait. And how do you typically try to get your water to the right temperature?
I don't.
Okay.
No, I mean, so for a period of time, what I tried doing was like I would turn the faucet on, turn it on to like medium heat or whatever, and I would get my little like Insta-Read thermometer and like just stick it in the stream coming out of the faucet, which is awful because I'm wasting water and whatever. And it's probably not even that accurate. And then I would just get it from there. But then I was like, then I started getting a sense for like the temperature. So just now I just do it by kind of touch, I guess. But like I said, it's more than an art than a science. Like I'm not literally getting an exact. I'm just kind of guesstimating at this point.
All right.
Because I think, I mean, I don't know. I'm by no means an expert, but like I think the water temperature is really it's like balancing the ambient temperature, right? So even if you don't put warm water in, it's still going to ferment. It might take a little bit longer. So I think I have come to start to just like look more at the bread and follow like know what I'm looking for in terms of the consistency at the different stages, and just use that as like my benchmark, I guess.
So what kind of things do you look for then at those different stages?
I guess the biggest one, like during the bulk fermentation, um, I call it like the jiggle. So I usually have the big bowl with the dough in there, and I like to just kind of get it a solid tap on the side. And if it has a nice jiggle to it, that usually tells me at least there's like enough air kind of in there. I guess the other stuff they say to look for is like, oh, it should start to be doming and be pulling off from the sides of the bowl a little bit. So those are a couple of things I look for during the bulk fermentation process.
Okay. And I just realized, so I mean, we've been chatting a lot about sourdough, but there's probably some terms we're using that some folks aren't entirely familiar with. So I'm going to throw a couple out, and Mitch, feel free to correct me on any of these. So the starter is the thing that you feed every day. And by feed, we mean give it flour and water. It's a mixture of bacteria that loves to eat the proteins and things that are in flour, and then what it creates is gases, and those gases create the sour flavors in your breads. So feeding it is just giving a little bit of that bacterial culture, some flour and water. That's your starter. When you use some starter to mix it with a larger volume of flour and water to create a sourdough bread, that's called a leaven, because it's the leavening agent, the thing that rises your bread. The first mixing stage of your sourdough is the autolyse. And so you mix the water, and the flour. So this is when it's all the flour, all the water, and your starter, and but not typically the salt. You mix that all up, and then you let it sit. And the sitting is the most important part of the autolyze. Usually anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour, but it's also very dependent on the temperatures you're working with in your room and the water that you used. Then you do some other steps. You do some folds. So instead of kneading sourdoughs, because they're so wet, you often fold the dough. Because if you were to throw it on your countertop at that point, you just get a big sticky mess all over the place. So you usually leave it in the bowl, do some folds. So it's sort of like you're kneading it, but the extra moisture content in a sourdough bread helps create those, the gluten structures more easily, because the moisture just kind of allows the gluten chains to meet each other and connect more easily than a drier loaf. So you've got that folding stage, and then you've got the first rise, which is also often referred to as the bulk fermentation. And then you do some shaping. So that's where you kind of get it into the shape that you want. And then there's another rise, which I can't remember for the life of me what it's called. Is it just the second
fermentation? Second rise?
There's another rise.
Yeah, actually I'm forgetting of it too.
It might be second bulk rise or something. But that's probably 95% accurate for the basic process. But yeah. Whereas we've been chatting about this the whole time, and there might be some folks who don't know some of the words that we're using.
You nailed it.
Thank you.
Couldn't have said it better. So yeah, I don't know. And there's definitely been times where I like skip or try to like accelerate a little bit too much, and it doesn't work out in the end. Oh, I had a question for you. Do you tend to let your have you ever done a bulk rise like overnight, like an overnight bulk rise, or longer?
On the counter or in the fridge?
In the fridge.
Yes, I have. Do
you have a preference for doing that, putting aside like the timing of it, like flavor wise?
Sometimes I do. It's definitely usually motivated by timing. Okay. Because when you have the flexibility of throwing it in the fridge for a while, you have a schedule that's much easier to fit. Right. So I can do things like create my leaven in the morning when I feed my starter, and then do the autolyze at night before I head to bed. Do a little bit of mixture, do some folds, and then do the bulk rise overnight as I'm sleeping. And then because it's cold, I don't necessarily have to do it right away in the morning. I could wait all the way until lunchtime or even a little bit later, and then do the shaping and everything after that.
Okay.
And then that timing works out well enough that I could have sourdough for dinner the second day if I wanted to. I think maybe the dinner's a little on the later side, but it kind of works.
Yeah, it's something I want to play around with a little bit more, because the more I read about it, it's like you can let it sit in there for even a couple days, and the longer it sits in there during the bulk rise, it's like getting more and more fermented, and you get more of that sourdough flavor. And like I feel like even after just a day, you get plenty of sourness to it. But I'm like, how far can you take it?
Yeah, and I've been curious about that recently as well too. About how do I experiment with this, and how do I'm also trying to figure out like how do I measure these variables accurately rather than just very sour. More sour than very sour.
Maybe we need to come up with a sour scale. You know how there's like the what is it, Scoville scale for like
there you go.
How spicy something is? There needs to be a sour scale.
It's like the Walsh Ginsburg scale of sourness.
Perfect. Patented here.
You heard it here first.
The scale will be kind of sour, really sour.
It's like the what is it, spiciness scale. Those are called Scovilles.
Yeah, Scoville. That's what it's called.
Yeah, so it had to have been a guy named Scoville.
Yeah.
Who was like, whatever, no one's named this. I got this.
That one is interesting because that actually does have there's a unit associated to it.
It probably didn't start
how it's
that
measured, I have
elaborate
no idea.
Though.
I can't imagine.
Yeah, it was like they started with like whatever, like this is more spicy than that one based on what? Based on Scoville over there. He said that one's spicier. We just feed it to him and he tells us.
Now that we're talking about it, though, I wonder if actually you can measure the alcohol content. I mean, there's not alcohol, and well, maybe there is a
The
trace
acid
amount to it.
content,
Maybe it's the acid content.
right? So is
Let's do a
there,
pH test of the dough.
that could work.
That'd
Yeah,
be
just use
interesting.
like some pH sticks. You might
Mhm.
need to take a certain measured amount of the dough at different stages, mix it with a predetermined and consistent amount of water so that it's like liquid enough for the pH stick to really
Yeah,
get
that's true.
a sense of it. But just use the same amount every time, like 25 grams or something for 10 grams of dough. Really mix it up and then dip the pH stick in and see what it's like. Or, I mean, you could go all the way and get a digital pH meter.
There you go.
That would
It's
be
a
kind
small
of cool.
investment.
I mean, I I buy a lot of kitchen stuff anyway, so the biggest issue is actually coming up with excuses to buy more kitchen stuff because I'm running out of excuses.
Mm-hmm.
I got one of my, like a purchase I put off for far too long, but I'm so glad I finally bought it, was a really good instant read thermometer. I had one for a while and there wasn't anything necessarily wrong with it other than it was slow and decently accurate. But I recently got the ThermoWorks, like ThermoPen MK4 or something,
Mm-hmm.
and it's so accurate and so fast. And I fell in love. I couldn't believe I fell in love with this kitchen accessory so quickly.
Who knew?
Right? It's just, love at first temperature test. That I started using it for all sorts of stuff when I get curious. It's like, all right, well, how hot is my coffee at the moment when I'm like, no, my mouth can tolerate this. Like, how hot is that? And what is it above that? And like, where is it when I feel like it's getting cold, but maybe it's not actually cold? And I love that thing so much that I then bought two more of their products, and they've got a little thermometer thing called the Dot, which I actually think I got it right here. It's this round
Huh.
little thermometer that has a probe on it on a long cord. And I bought that because my oven is so inconsistent. And I know you and I have chatted about this before. My oven will have, every oven swings. Every oven has a variable of typically plus or minus 50 or 15 degrees off of wherever you set it. But mine will inconsistently jump plus or minus 50 to 80 degrees off of where you set it. So, and like if it was consistent, that'd be fine. I was trying to map it the other day. Actually, I've got the note cards for it. I was like running through, like I set it at one temp, and then here's the max I saw after 30 minutes in the min, and then cleared those, and then did it again for another 30 minutes to see like, okay, at 350, how much should I adjust my temp so that I can use it in the future? And then I gave it a few days, and then I tried it again, and it was a totally different reading. So I probably just need to get a new oven. But in the meantime, I can tell when things are going horribly wrong because of this new thermometer.
I don't know how you managed to use that oven.
It
Like successfully bake stuff with it. That's crazy.
it's emotionally trying. I think when I made the birthday cake for myself this year, which turned out great, I'm very upset with this oven because it was really close to just totally screwing up the whole cake. And like, I think Callo probably could tell you how upset I was with the oven and its inconsistencies and the temperature swings I was seeing. And I I have to practice a lot more in understanding when something's done based off the internal temperature and like look and feel. So I take things and I poke them a lot more now. I like test the texture with my finger. I use color a lot more. So I'm hoping that by having an oven that is really inconsistent and quite terrible, it's actually forcing me to become a better baker because I'm
Go.
relying on other senses to determine whether or not something's actually done.
That's a really nice way of saying you have a really crappy oven.
Thank you. I have a skill for spinning things to be the positive.
There you go.
But so that the thermometer thing reminds me of something else I wanted to ask you, and start kind of wrapping up, we've been going for almost an hour in here, and the second half just disappeared. Um, what are, or what's the biggest change you've seen in your baking in the last 6 to 12 months?
In terms of like my approach with it or the
Yeah,
outcomes?
like how have you changed some processes, or what's something you learned in that time frame that you really wish you'd known sooner? Like how is
Mm,
your approach or the tools you use changed in such a fundamental way that you're like, oh my God, I wish I had discovered or learned or known about this way.
yeah. Kind of piggybacking on a couple things I mentioned before, but and you were just mentioning this too, but like learning to trust the sight and like your senses of the bread or whatever you're baking, opposed to like relying on the recipe. I talked about how growing up I was kind of afraid of baking because it seemed so overwhelming, and like I liked the how a recipe for just cooking food was like pretty easy to follow and it was like pretty flexible. But baking, it's like any time duration that's in there or like weight or temperature, it's sure it's like a best estimate, but it's so dependent on like all these factors around you. So that's kind of when I jokingly said I don't measure or I don't gauge the temperature of the water. I'm like actually kind of being serious. It's like there's so much you can just learn by just trial and error and seeing what works for you. And like, are my loaves of bread the best in the world? No, by no means are they. But like, and there's like every loaf is going to be a little bit different. But I think that's the biggest process change I've seen in myself as I've kind of gotten deeper and deeper in the world of baking sourdough.
Nice.
And also just like playing around and experimenting. Like you can, I mean, at the end of the day, like sourdough is just talking about using wild yeast, like out of a starter. But theoretically, you can actually adapt any recipe that uses normal dry yeast to use sourdough. Like whether it's bagels or like a cake or um, this weekend I'm going to try making some challah for Rosh Hashanah. I haven't decided if I'm going to do a sourdough or if you go with dry yeast. But point being, it's like you can adapt it, which is really really cool. It's like you're taming a wild beast.
Yeah, it's that like freedom to feel like you can experiment
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes know it's not going to work out, but also just know that you're going to learn something every time.
Yeah, I think I always have this fear. I don't like wasting stuff. So I always have this fear of like, oh, if I mess up, it's gonna be a whole loaf that I wasted. But I have to remind myself, like, we're talking about flour and water. Like, it's not a very expensive amount of waste. And sure, there's like physical waste, but you can do stuff. You can make croutons with it, or I don't know, just eat terrible bread.
Yeah. I I also have a, a big aversion to food waste. And there's been a lot of times where I've actually had difficulty with it because it's like, oh, I want to test this other thing, but what am I going to do with all this extra food? And it
Mm-hmm.
was great when I could go into the office and bring my extra baked goods to the office.
Yep.
Like I was practicing what ended up being a 4-tier Black Forest cake earlier this year, right before everything closed down.
Mm-hmm.
And I was practicing it because I was pulling some recipes from, it was originally based off of a Gordon Ramsay recipe. And it was for my girlfriend's birthday, and her favorite cake is Black Forest. And I wanted to make sure I got
Choice.
it right. And I'd never made it before. So I'm like, she's out of town for a week. This is perfect. I'm going to test the recipe, and I can get rid of the evidence, so to speak, by bringing it into the office, and I don't have to eat a whole cake myself. And it was great. I tested it because the first one, it was clear that the process that was listed in the place where I got the recipe was lacking some steps. And so it made like a huge mess. The amount of batter that was involved with that cake was way more than should fit into the cake pan that they recommend, and all sorts of stuff. So I ended up making this cake 3 times in a week. There's no way I could eat that, and I would definitely feel like a horrible human being if I just threw it all away. So the office was great, and people love it when you show up in the office and you have cake. Like, no one turns that down. Um, but then while we've been stuck in COVID here, and it's harder to interact with folks, I was having issues with doing that again. If you saw my Instagram feed, I got a lot of comments from people about like, what are you doing with all this extra food? Like you try the same recipe like 6 times, doing it slightly differently every time. Are you like morbidly obese and we don't see photos of you, or what's going on? And I came up with this great trick. I hopped on to Nextdoor and I just left a comment saying, I'm a chef and a baker, and I often have to do recipe development where I make a ton of food, and it's more than I could ever eat myself. If there's anyone here in the neighborhood who would like free baked goods every once in a while, just send me a message. I'll write down your contact info, and when I've got extras, I'll let you know. And my goal was like 2 people. Like if there was 2 extra people other than my direct neighbors who I've already given a ton of food to, that would be enough. If I could just spread that out by another couple of people, that would be enough. I got something like 46 responses in
What?
48 hours. And I don't know if I'll ever be able to get enough food to
Now
any
you're
one of them.
committed.
Yeah, thankfully I didn't present it as like, send me your orders and I will make them. But it's just like when I have extras. And then like I got connected to some cool nonprofits that bring food to those in need, like families who are like non-native English speakers who are they're trying to navigate. This is a really interesting nonprofit. They help families who are non-native English speakers who have health insurance and are going through some sort of health crisis, but they're having troubles navigating the health insurance world. Because even when you're a native English speaker in the US, it's confusing as hell. No one understands it, and probably by design. So imagine if English was not your first language and you're trying to figure it out. So they help out a lot of these families who are already going through a legitimate medical crisis by bringing them food. And so every once in a while, when I have some extra food, someone swings by and picks that up from me. So if anyone out there is worried like, oh, if I'm making all this extra food, what do I do with it? I don't know how to get rid of it. I don't want to eat it all myself, even though, I love cookies, but I don't want to eat 5 dozen in a night. Just hop on to Nextdoor and offer free baked goods, and you will probably get a lot of responses.
That's awesome. That's really cool you do that. I mean, I think food is such a like binder. It brings people together. It's like it's like such a common thread amongst everyone. Everyone eats food. I know it's cliche and everything, but like even when I travel, like it's people are like, oh, what do you want to do when you go to country XYZ? Like, I want to eat the food because I feel like it kind of is a little window into what that culture is like. So I think that's awesome. Like by sharing the food with your neighbors, you're like opening a little window into your world of like, hey, I like to experiment with food.
I like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Nice. All right. So we should open this up for Q&A now. Before we do, I'll share a little quick message. I know most folks who found this event found it through meetup.com. It's a great platform. The biggest downside of that platform is its communication tools are really terrible, especially from the standpoint of an organizer like myself. It's really hard to communicate with you about when we have new events and what they involve. So if you would like to stay informed in the easiest way possible about future events coming up and who the speakers are going to be, you should go to classictim.com, spelled exactly like it sounds, classictim.com. And near the top of the page, there'll be a button like Join Next Event. Click on that and sign up, and you'll get informed about future events. And I also, we mentioned this very briefly earlier, on my Instagram, I give away a cookbook a week. And I'll also announce those in those emails, because even on Instagram, if you're following someone, you don't necessarily see all their posts. Instagram's got its own algorithm for what it thinks you want to see that day. And so you might miss an opportunity to win a book like the Josie Baker Bread Book. So that's my little plug there about the best way to stay informed about future events like these and future speakers and find ways to win cookbooks or get recipes every once in a while is go to classictim.com and just sign up with your name and your best email address. Okay, I'm going to switch to the gallery view, and anyone that's got a question, just go ahead and raise your hand and I'll unmute you. All right, Brian, I have a feeling I know what Brian's going to start with. There we go.
Hey guys, I really appreciate the conversation. Mitch, you're speaking about breaking bread in the community. So I have to ask what was the bread that almost broke you, like in terms of experimenting and trying?
That's a good question. So recently I tried making a baguette for the first time, which seems like such a straightforward thing, right? It's like this long tube of bread. Turns out it was just not as easy as you would think. Partially just the dough I was working with was so different than what I had done in the past. And also I realized that the baking vessel, usually I use a cast iron pot or something, but the baguette doesn't fit in there. So I kind of tried to figure out what I could use at a pizza stone. And I tried putting it in there and it flopped over, got on the oven rack, started instantly burning and smoking and set off my fire alarm. And it turned out like a weird, long, curvy hot dog, and it wasn't pretty at all. It actually tasted not that bad once it came out of the oven, but it was not a fun one to work with. And I'm committed. I'm going to try it again, making a baguette. I have a different idea of how I'm going to put it. I think I'm just going to use a baking tray, just keep it simple. So that was not a great one.
Cool. Thank you for sharing.
Sure.
All right. Who else has a question about sourdoughs, baking in general, life philosophies? Oh, here's one. This one, Kala typed it in. Mitch, did you develop your own recipe for sourdough now, or is it from a book you follow?
It's kind of like a fusion of just all the recipes I've seen in the past. I think nowadays I mostly follow the tartine recipe in terms of the ratios. But then I use the ratios from there, and then maybe the process from Josie's book, and then just kind of hack things around as I'm going through. So it's kind of a hybrid of all of these different recipes I've seen.
Nice. Yeah, I've found with a lot of my baking these days, Kala says thank you. With a lot of my baking these days, I'm looking at the main portion of a recipe in one place, but I'm taking parts from somewhere else. So often if I'm trying to bake something, it's not one source of truth. I might have 4 different cookbooks open looking at the same type of recipe and looking through them and saying, what do I like about these? And what do I not like about this one or that one? And what parts do I want to bring in from each one to make what I hope is the near perfect version? Another question for you, Mitch, from Karen. Have you made a gluten-free sourdough?
I have tried. I haven't even tried making the sourdough. I've tried making a gluten-free starter. I've not been successful thus far. I'm committed because one of my cousins is gluten-free, and I'm I need to make her bread, but I've not been able to do it. It's just it starts to kind of bubble. I think the first time I went, it got moldy, and I was I give up. So I'm committed, but no, I'm not successfully. But I've seen some good recipes online. I think it's generally some variant of rice flour, a brown rice flour is a good sourdough starter for gluten-free. So I'm going to give that another shot.
Am I correct in thinking that sorghum is gluten-free?
I think it might be. Yeah.
I feel like I've heard of folks making a sorghum starter and using that as their starter and a good amount of the flour for a gluten-free loaf.
That's interesting. I might have to give that a shot.
Maybe sorghum
right.
spelt or something.
Mm-hmm. Another one that's surprisingly gluten-free, despite the name, is buckwheat.
Yep.
I did not realize that.
Super versatile. You can eat it. You can take the hulls and put it into a pillowcase and have a remarkably comfortable pillow. Have you ever used a buckwheat? The random shit that I know. Have you ever
Wisconsin facts.
a buckwheat hull pillow before?
Can't say I have.
They're great. I was introduced to them in Japan, because it's actually a fairly common type of pillow in Japan. They're much smaller typically, but it's a zipped up pillowcase full of buckwheat hulls, and it like perfectly conforms to your head and neck. It stays very cool. It's great. If anyone is trying to look for a new pillow and you don't want to break the bank, buckwheat hull pillows are awesome. And if you get one that has a zipper, you can always remove or add any volume that you need to kind of get the density you're aiming for. So this is not just a baking event.
And if you ever get hungry, you just pull some out of the pillow and start milling it up into a bread.
Well, I don't know how much is left that's useful when it's just the hull.
Oh, it's just the hull. I see.
Just the hull.
Okay.
Yeah. So like you could get the hulls for your pillow and the rest for making bread.
Buckwheat is actually a really good addition to a loaf of sourdough. Like I think the ratio I've used like 5% buckwheat or something, and it creates like this richness that you don't really get from other wheats.
Just 5%, does it?
Yeah, because it's the flavor. I've actually put some in before where it almost felt like it's overpowering. So I think now I just kind of tone it back a little bit, but it's good.
All right. Thanks, Brian. And we had another question from Barb. Barb was asking or saying, I was given 6 quail eggs today. Any suggestions of what to make with them? First off, that's really cool that somehow someone just gave you 6 quail eggs. I want to get Mitch's opinion on this too, but the first thing that comes to mind for me is if you've got some heavy cream, heat up some heavy cream in a pot and crack all the quail eggs in a separate bowl. Once the cream is pretty warm, you don't necessarily want it boiling, but you want it pretty warm. Dump the eggs in there, and you're basically going to make quail eggs that are semi-poached, semi-fried in heavy cream. And it's supposed to be to die for. It's supposed to be like the most amazing way to fry an egg is in heavy cream. And I can only imagine if you did quail eggs, it would be very decadent.
I defer to you entirely. I had never heard of that before. That's really interesting. And I've never used quail eggs either, but I'd be very curious to know how that comes out. It seems so like tiny and delicate.
Right? I feel like I used quail eggs once a long time ago. I was probably like cooking with my dad or something. And because he will often get very obscure ingredients, especially from a kid's perspective. And be like, no, we have to absolutely use this right now. And you're like, well, I don't even know why you bought this. But I'd probably use quail eggs at some point then. And I probably screwed up a few of them because if I was as young as I'm thinking, I probably did not crack them very well. All right. Are there any other questions? Folks can raise their hands. The comments work as well. Food, baking. Oh, hey, look at that. There we go. We got Mark's hand up here. Let me unmute you. Oh, you called in on Madeline's name. Is that working? Yeah, I think you're unmuted now.
So
there we go.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Cool. So you mentioned a lot of different books and things like that, cookbooks. But for people like me who don't like to read as much, do you have any like YouTube recommendations, like people you follow on YouTube or things like that we can just kind of watch videos of this kind of happen, or do you?
There was actually one YouTube video. I would have to find it again, but it was like the 15 mistakes that every like new baker makes. And I found it, even as like somebody who's baking not that long, I find it so useful. Like I learned a lot and I'm like, oh yeah, I should try that. He talks a lot about like what to be looking for, the different stages. Search like 15 mistakes bakers make. And I found that one is great. And it's a pretty quick watch.
I feel like I saw that same one recently and then dove into more content from that individual. And I can't remember their name right now. It's one of those things where it's like, once you see the name, it becomes very obvious that they make sourdough bread all the time. But I can at least tell you there are several very talented sourdough bread bakers on YouTube. Some of them have new videos like every other day, but they'll go into the process of what they're doing, how often they feed things, the volume at which they're feeding it, like what sort of issues you might be seeing in your bread. So they might have purposely underproved one loaf and overproved another so they can show you. Oh, perfect. Mitch put a comment in here. 15 mistakes most beginner sourdough bakers make, and a link to the YouTube as well. And so you can like get examples of this is what it looks like when it's overproved and when it's underproved. And another good example of that is that this isn't free, but I've found some really good resources through Masterclass. A lot of their cooking classes are really very good. The Dominique Ansel one, the guy who made the cronut, that one's pretty good. And it finishes up with him going through the whole process of making croissants. And the most fascinating part of it was, I think there's a 6-minute bonus video at the end where he talks about, here's how you can identify the problems. And he's showing you little screenshots and like circling them with a stylus on his iPad. And even though he's pointing them out, it's still hard to identify some, but some of them now you'll start to see in other places. You're like, oh, that weird dip means it was underproved, or oh, there's a thicker crust on that croissant, which means their oven was actually too cold. And then you'll see like posts from bakeries online and you're half tempted to message them and say, hey, just FYI, I think your oven might be running a little cold.
And I also thought of one other cooking guy who I follow on YouTube. His name just goes by Alex, like the French cooking guy. He's a French guy who likes to cook. He has tons of videos about all different types of things that he's cooking. Like he's trying to make the perfect meatball or the perfect croissant or the perfect pizza. And he has a playlist of like making sourdough, which I'll post here as well. He's a quirky, funny guy to watch. He's very entertaining. So a lot of good content from him.
Cool. Thanks. I'll have to check them out.
Yeah, I'm excited to see what you make, Mark.
Yeah, we haven't made much bread, especially sourdough. So I'll have to try it. I'm excited.
And is it safe to assume you do not yet have a starter?
We don't.
Okay. There's directions everywhere about how to get starters started. I often find that when you look up online, people overcomplicate it. They add way too many steps or things to worry about. Like if there's anything you could take away from Mitch tonight, it's relax and just bake. That's kind of what I've been getting from almost everything. I'm like, yeah, they say do blah and blah. If you're trying to be in the top 1% or better in the world, maybe you really need to focus on those things. But you're going to see success on a lot of stuff with like an 80% effort. Or maybe even more like a 20% effort, and you'll get the 80% success is a better way of putting it.
If it's 20% good, it's a success.
All right. So yeah, getting the starter made is actually fairly trivial. That being said, I've been experimenting with ways to make it easier to get people starter. So several months ago, I dehydrated a bunch of my extra starter one morning, and it's been sitting in a jar for several months. And later this week or next week, I want to finally take it out of the jar and see if I can restart a starter from this completely dry sheets of sourdough discard to see if it starts back up within a couple of days. And if it does, then great. I have a super easy way to share my starter with other folks.
Awesome.
And then thank you for the question, Mark and Madeline. And another question from Kala. Mitch, have you tried making sourdough with charcoal in it?
No, I've not even ever cooked with charcoal before. So I don't have a ton of experience in that. Curious though, to know how it would taste.
Yeah, I keep seeing a lot of great pictures and like Instagram with charcoal with a crave. So I was wondering like if you found a recipe that you were looking into, because I tried to make a charcoal banana bread, was semi-successful. So I'm getting ready for Halloween.
Does it like change the flavor profile?
It does not. So it basically looks really like dark.
Oh, you have it right there. Whoa. That looks so cool.
I was wondering if you experimented with sourdough, because I see a lot of bakers now doing that with activated charcoal.
I guess I know what I'm doing this weekend now. charcoal sourdough.
I don't think you need much. I think a little bit goes a long way. All right. Any other final questions? Otherwise, I think actually one last call. Mitch, if folks wanted to find you on social media, what's the best way for them to find you?
Yeah, the only one I'm most really active on is Instagram, but it's just at Mitch Ginsburg. And I can't even say I'm overly active there, but every once in a while I'll post a photo here or there, or add a story. So feel free to follow.
And that's Berg with B-U-R-G,
Yes,
correct?
like a hamburger,
Okay, cool.
not the ERG. I do see there are two more questions a little up in the chat.
Oh, did I miss some?
I think so.
Oh, yeah.
Under the pillow recommendation.
Oh, I totally missed those. Thanks for the call. What flavorings can you add to your sourdough bread?
Yeah, I mean, Cal brings up a good point. Like you can really put anything, and it should probably be pretty good. And like I think the other thing that kind of scared me around like earlier is, well, if you add stuff to it, and do you have to adjust like the recipe or adjust like the process at all? And what I've found again through my like very informal experimentation is no, like you can just add stuff in and just follow the same general process, and it should turn out pretty good. So like with the chocolate sourdough I made, I just kind of like added it in, and the process was generally the same. And it was great. I made like a walnut sourdough recently that was really nice. I did what else? I made like an onion and rosemary bread where like I cook the onions up first, like saute them, get them kind of like brown, and then mix that in. So yeah, I think you can put tons of different flavorings in.
Nice. Yeah, I find that baked goods are pretty flexible with adding flavorings. And the only times you need to worry about changing the moisture is if the flavoring you're adding is mostly liquid based.
Yes, that's
So
a good
like
point.
if you're adding honey to a recipe, you might need to adjust the moisture a little bit, but it's not too bad. But if you were adding like some kind of liqueur to a recipe for adding a lot of it, it's definitely going to change your moisture content. Or this was an example I saw recently. If you make like a banana bread and you decide to add more bananas, you're drastically changing the moisture content of the bread, so you need to adjust for it. But if you're adding like seeds, rosemary is a really good one because the flavor of rosemary is so pungent because it's oil based rather than water based. So that's why dry rosemary still has so much flavor. So rosemary is a really good one. You can play around with the types of salts you use as well. And so you can use different flavorings coming from different salts. So playing around with stuff like that, or like Mitch's example before of when he cooked the flour to make that really light, fluffy loaf. And then we went into that little rabbit hole about like, well, how else could you impart flavors into that? Like you could probably make an espresso loaf and use espresso as part of the liquid that you use for cooking the flour. And now all of a sudden you got this loaf of bread that seems to go perfectly with your morning cup of coffee.
One counter argument about so we didn't really talk about hydration levels at all. But what I found is like, you'll see recipes with varying levels of hydration. Like you'll see it as low as like, oh, 70% hydration, or like 80 something percent. And if you're not familiar, like essentially all that is saying is the ratio of water to flour, very roughly speaking. So if you even were to add something in like that had a slightly higher water content, you're only increasing the hydration level, and you can still work. It might make the bread a little harder to work with, like a little bit stickier or something, but it's totally viable. So I stand by my point of like, just go with it and just see how it works.
Yeah, it's not going to switch from a moment of like, it'll work now, and now all of a sudden you've ruined it. It's just, it might turn out differently, or the shaping will be a slightly different process. But
yeah,
like ruined baked goods it hardly ever happens. Either it's way underbaked and you had something in there that needed to be baked enough, like the eggs had to get to a certain temp to be considered safe, or you way overbaked it and you totally burnt it. Other than that, yeah, pretty flexible. So the other one, cake baking secrets with sourdough. Mitch, if I recall correctly, you made a chocolate sourdough cake, right?
I did make a chocolate sourdough cake once, and I'm trying to wrap my brain about the process of how I did it. I think I found a recipe. Maybe it was even New York Times or something. Um, I would say that is one where you want to be a little more cautious around like the hydration. Just with a cake, it's like you don't want to mess too much with like the ratios there. Um, it turned out great. Like I think it wasn't like a sourdough bread type of sour, but it was, you definitely had some more like denseness to like the flavor profile, I guess. It came out really good. And it was very moist, that's for sure as well. So um, I can't say I have any secrets per se, but just because I just followed recipes online, but there's plenty out there, I'm sure.
I haven't done a sourdough cake. I've done sourdough pancakes. There's actually a surprisingly good recipe online from King Arthur flour for sourdough pancakes. You can just use your discard to make what's basically a leaven the night before and mix it in with the rest of the ingredients morning of, and they're delicious. You get a nice little sour tang to it as you're doing it. I guess, but if who is this from? This is from Karen. Karen, if you're looking for any cake baking secrets in general, I can say the number one tip I've got is using something called cake bands. If you're looking for really nice flat bakes where you have to do little to no trimming before you stack your layers. So a cake band is something that helps reflect or absorb the heat from the oven along the edges of your pan so that the edge of your cake doesn't cook so fast that the rising stops while the middle is still doming. That's why you see that difference in height. The outer edges are exposed to so much more heat that they cook and they lock in their shape and they stop rising. But the center doesn't get heat right from the edges right through the metal, so it's allowed to get more rise over time and you get that big dome. If you add cake bands, all of a sudden you slow down that heat absorption from the side of the pan and you get a much more even, often you can get it so flat there's no trimming required at all to make a nice even consistent layer of cake. And you can buy them on Amazon. You can make them out of aluminum foil. I just took a couple old kitchen towels I wasn't using anymore, and I cut some strips probably about, I want to say, an inch tall, about the length of the towel, twice. So I just cut a couple strips and then I stitched the ends together. And before I bake, I soak those in some cool water, wring them out, wrap it around the pan right before I set it in the oven. And that's made a huge difference in my cakes. So not sourdough specific, but in case you were looking for other cake info.
And you mentioned King Arthur. I realized the sourdough chocolate cake I made was actually a King Arthur recipe. They have a surprising number of awesome recipes on their website if you're looking for new stuff.
Yeah, and I don't know if they've been like this for forever or if it's a more recent thing. I've definitely seen them more active on things like social media and connecting to more influencers and driving more campaigns and things,
I got to move that flour.
right? It's got to go somewhere. Wasn't a problem a few months ago, but maybe they're running into that problem again. All right. Well, Mitch, this was a ton of fun. I'm so glad we did this. Thank you, everyone, for joining us and for the great questions. And if you want to find out about future events, again, the best way to do it is go to classictim.com and sign up. And oh, thank you, Scott. And I'm really looking forward to seeing all of you again. We do have another guest lined up probably for next month. My aim is doing these at least once a month. And we have a classically trained pastry chef who already told me that she'd love to come on and chat about her experience and share some more info with us. So in the meantime, I hope you all get to do some really cool things in your kitchens. I hope you're staying safe and healthy out there. And I wish you all the best. I can't wait to see you again in the future. See you, everybody.